The gleaming windows of Reed Enterprises headquarters reflected the morning sun as Jackson Reed sat in his top-floor office, staring at the quarterly reports scattered across his desk. His father's photo watched him from the wall, a reminder of the legacy he inherited. The numbers were good, excellent even, but Jackson felt disconnected from the company he'd been running for the past 5 years. Another merger proposal landed on his desk that morning. The corporate vultures were circling, seeing Reed Furniture as just another acquisition target. They didn't care about the workers or the history, just the bottom line. Jackson pushed back from his desk and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. His assistant Sarah knocked on the door. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, Mr. Reed." "Cancel it," Jackson said, still facing the window. "Cancel everything for the next month." "Sir." Sarah's voice carried her confusion. "The quarterly presentation can wait." Jackson turned around, already removing his tie. "I need to see something for myself." 3 hours later, Jackson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing himself. He'd traded his tailored suit for worn jeans and a flannel shirt from a local department store. His perfectly styled hair was now messy and pushed under a baseball cap. A few days of stubble completed the transformation. He'd practiced lowering his voice, dropping the polished accent he'd gained from years of private education. The drive to Maplewood took longer than expected. The small town looked exactly like the photos in the company archives: modest homes, local businesses, and the sprawling Reed Furniture factory that employed nearly a quarter of the population. Jackson parked his rental car, a beat-up Ford pickup, in the employee lot and joined the stream of workers heading in for the afternoon shift. "You the new guy?" A supervisor checked his paperwork, carefully crafted under the name Jake Miller. "Right, orientation was yesterday. Get yourself to Station 4, they're short-handed." The factory floor was a maze of machinery and activity. The air smelled of sawdust and varnish. Jake tried to blend in, observing the practiced movements of the other workers. When a stack of boards needed moving, he jumped in to help, his muscles straining under the unexpected weight. "Thanks, man." A worker nodded at him. "I'm Steve." "You're new." "Jake," he replied, mimicking the local accent. "Just started." The lunch bell rang at noon. Jake followed the crowd to the break room, clutching the paper bag containing a sandwich he'd hastily made that morning. He hesitated, scanning the room for an empty seat. "Over here." A woman's voice called out. She was sitting with a small group, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "New guys stick together, right?" "I'm Emily. Started last week." Jake sat down, noting the easy camaraderie at the table. The conversation flowed naturally, complaints about shift schedules, jokes about the ancient coffee machine, stories about weekend plans. Emily talked about her sister's college graduation, the pride evident in her voice. "What brought you to Maplewood?" Steve asked between bites of his lunch. Jake had rehearsed this part. "Looking for a fresh start. Needed a change." "Don't we all?" someone commented, drawing knowing laughs. As Jake listened to their stories, medical bills, second jobs, dreams put on hold, he felt a growing unease. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or statistics in a report. These were real people, facing real challenges. And here he was, a billionaire playing working class, thinking he could understand their lives by pretending to be one of them. The afternoon shift seemed longer than the morning. His hands were sore from handling materials, his back aching from unfamiliar labor. But Jake found himself paying attention to details he'd never considered before: the way the ancient ventilation system struggled to clear the air, the broken water fountain everyone avoided, the careful way workers preserved their protective gear because replacements were hard to come by. As he drove back to his rented apartment that evening, Jake realized he'd started something he couldn't easily walk away from. The question was, how long could he maintain this charade before someone saw through it? 2 weeks into his job at the factory, Jake found himself drawn to the design department during breaks. Emily worked there part-time, sketching furniture designs when she wasn't operating machinery. He watched as she spread her latest drawings across a worn workbench. "See this?" Emily pointed to a detailed sketch of a dining table. "We could use reclaimed wood from local demolition sites. There's perfectly good maple and oak being thrown away every day." Jake leaned closer, genuinely interested. The joints are different from our standard design. Traditional Japanese joinery. Emily's eyes lit up as she explained. No metal fasteners needed. It's stronger and eliminates the need for hardware that often contains harmful chemicals. Plus, it makes disassembly and recycling easier at the end of the product's life. Have you shown these to management? Emily's enthusiasm dimmed. 3 times. They say it's too expensive, too different from our current production line. She rolled up the drawings. But I'm not giving up. I'm saving every penny to open my own workshop someday. From across the room, Mark Anderson watched their interaction with narrowed eyes. Emily's brother had worked at the factory for 5 years, recently becoming involved in workers' rights advocacy. He approached them, positioning himself protectively near his sister. Getting pretty comfortable here, aren't you, Jake? Mark's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Funny how you picked up the production process so quickly. I'm a fast learner, Jake replied, maintaining eye contact. Right. Mark crossed his arms. Where did you say you worked before? I didn't. Jake turned back to Emily's designs, trying to redirect the conversation. These joints you're showing, they'd actually save money in the long run, wouldn't they? Less hardware, fewer replacement parts. Emily nodded eagerly, but Mark wasn't finished. You know a lot about production costs for someone who just started on the floor. Mark, Emily warned. Stop interrogating everyone who talks to me. I'm just curious about our new friend here. Mark pulled out his phone. Jake Miller, right? Mind if I add you on social media? Always good to connect with coworkers. Jake felt his heart rate increase. His fake social media profiles wouldn't hold up under close scrutiny. Not much for social media, he said. Prefer real conversations. The afternoon shift bell saved him from further questioning. As workers returned to their stations, Emily caught Jake's arm. Want to stay late? I could use help with a prototype I'm working on. They spent the next 2 hours in a quiet corner of the workshop. Emily had salvaged wood from discarded pallets, transforming them into components for a small side table. Jake found himself impressed not just by her creativity, but by her practical understanding of manufacturing processes. If we modified the current assembly line slightly, he suggested, forgetting himself for a moment, these could be produced without major retooling. Emily looked at him curiously. You seem to know a lot about this stuff. I read a lot, Jake said quickly. Industry magazines, you know. As they worked, Jake noticed how Emily's presence made him forget about his deception. Her passion was genuine, her ideas innovative. She spoke about sustainability not as a marketing gimmick, but as a moral imperative. My grandmother's furniture lasted decades, she said, sanding a joint to perfection. Now we make things designed to fall apart in a few years. It's not just bad business, it's wrong. Jake thought about the cost-cutting measures he'd approved in recent years, the shift toward cheaper materials and simpler designs. He'd never considered the environmental impact, the waste generated by planned obsolescence. From the doorway, Mark watched them work. After his shift, he sat in his car, typing Jake's description into various search engines. Something about the new worker's knowledge and behavior didn't add up, and Mark was determined to figure out what Jake was hiding. The prototype took shape under their hands. Emily's design was beautiful in its simplicity, functional yet elegant. When they finally stepped back to admire their work, Jake realized they were standing closer than necessary. We make a good team, Emily said softly. Jake wanted to agree, wanted to pull her closer, but Mark's suspicions weighed on him. Every moment he spent with Emily only made his eventual unmasking more painful. I should go, he said reluctantly. Early shift tomorrow. As he walked to his truck, Jake saw Mark's car still in the parking lot, the glow of a laptop screen visible through the window. The web of lies he'd woven was starting to tangle around him, threatening to unravel everything, including his growing feelings for Emily. The signs of unrest started small. Whispered conversations in the break room. Papers being passed between workers during shift changes. Union pamphlets appearing in lockers. Jake noticed it all, watching as discontent spread through the factory like a slow current. Steve approached Jake during their morning break, glancing around before speaking. There's a meeting tonight. After shift. Anderson's garage. You should come. What kind of meeting? Jake asked, though he already knew. The kind where we discuss why we're making record profits but still using broken equipment. Steve's voice was low. The kind where we talk about why our health insurance barely covers basics while executives get private healthcare. Jake felt his stomach twist. He'd signed off on those budget decisions himself, seeing them only as numbers on paper. Is this legal? We have the right to organize. Mark appeared behind them, his presence commanding attention. Unless you have a problem with that. No problem, Jake said carefully. Just want to understand what we're getting into. The meeting drew 30 workers to Mark's father's garage. The space smelled of motor oil and frustration. Jake sat in the back, watching Emily pass out photocopied documents, spreadsheets showing the factory's public financial records compared to worker wages over the past decade. Corporate profits have increased 300% since 2015, Mark stood at the front, pointing to highlighted figures. Our wages. Up 12%. Barely keeping pace with inflation. Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Jake recognized the numbers. He'd presented similar data to shareholders, proudly highlighting the company's growth. The ventilation system hasn't been upgraded in 15 years, a worker called out. My kid's got asthma now. They cut our overtime during peak season, another added. Then hired temps instead. Emily stood up. What about innovation? We're still using designs from the 90s while our competitors invest in sustainable practices. We could be leading the industry, but management won't even look at new ideas. Jake felt each comment like a physical blow. These weren't unreasonable demands, they were basic needs he'd overlooked in his pursuit of efficiency. We need to organize properly, Mark continued. Form a real union. But we have to be careful. Management will try to stop us. They might already have people watching. Several eyes turned to Jake. He forced himself to appear calm, though his heart raced. Jake, Mark called out. You've been here a month now. Where do you stand on this? The room fell silent. Jake stood slowly, aware of Emily watching him. I think we deserve better. Safe conditions. Fair pay. A voice in decisions that affect our lives. Pretty words, Mark challenged. But are you willing to risk your job for them? Because that's what it might take. Yes, Jake said, surprising himself with his conviction. I am. The meeting continued late into the night. Workers shared stories of hardship, medical bills, second jobs, delayed retirements. Jake listened, each story adding to his growing sense of guilt and responsibility. Afterward, in the parking lot, Mark cornered him. You're not who you say you are. What do you mean? The way you talk about business strategies, profit margins, that's not shop floor knowledge. Mark stepped closer. Who are you really working for? I'm just trying to help, Jake insisted. Help who? Mark's voice was hard. Because if you're gathering intel for management, I promise you dash. Mark. Emily interrupted, approaching them. Leave him alone. Jake's been nothing but supportive. You're too trusting, Em. Mark turned away but called back over his shoulder. Just remember, Jake, we're watching too. Emily stayed behind, looking troubled. Sorry about my brother. He's protective, especially since. Since what? Last time workers tried to organize, 3 years ago. The leaders were all fired. Company restructuring, they called it. She hugged herself against the night chill. Mark was friends with them. He's never gotten over it. Jake remembered signing those termination papers. Another decision made from his comfortable office, without understanding the human cost. Do you trust me? He asked suddenly. Emily studied his face in the dim light. I want to. But Mark's right about one thing, you're different. Sometimes the way you talk, the things you know. I'm on your side, Jake said. It wasn't a complete lie, not anymore. That's all that matters. But as he drove home, Jake knew he was running out of time. The workers were organizing, putting themselves at risk. His presence among them, his deception, could undermine everything they were fighting for. Yet revealing himself now would destroy any chance of helping them, and any hope of a future with Emily. For the first time in his life, Jackson Reed, the billionaire CEO, had found something worth fighting for. The question was, could Jake, the factory worker, survive long enough to make a difference? The factory's break room had become a war room. During lunch, Jake watched workers huddled over tables, discussing strategy and sharing grievances. He'd volunteered to help organize, partly to stay informed, partly because he genuinely wanted to help. "We need someone to document safety violations," Mark announced during an informal meeting. "Photos, incident reports, anything that shows a pattern of negligence." "I can do it," Jake offered. "I work different stations, so it won't look suspicious if I'm moving around." Emily touched his arm. "Be careful. Remember what happened to Miguel when he reported that broken guardrail?" "Transferred to third shift," someone muttered. "Never saw his kids awake." Jake spent his shifts photographing subtle problems with his phone: worn-out safety equipment, damaged ventilation ducts, expired first aid supplies. Each image represented a cost-cutting measure he'd approved without understanding its impact. After work, Emily invited him to her small apartment above the local diner. The space was modest but warm, filled with prototype furniture pieces and design sketches. They sat on her handmade couch, sharing takeout Chinese food. "I've never shown anyone else this," Emily said, pulling out a worn notebook. "It's my business plan for the sustainable furniture store." Jake read through her careful projections and market analysis. Her research was thorough, her vision clear. "This could work," he said honestly. "You've thought of everything. Except the startup money." Emily laughed without humor. "At my current salary, I'll have enough saved in about 20 years. Jake wanted to reach for his checkbook, to solve her problems with a signature. Instead, he asked, "What made you stay here? With your skills, you could work anywhere. This town raised me. These people are family." She moved closer to him on the couch. "When Mom died, everyone pitched in. Store credit at the grocery, casseroles for weeks, taking turns driving Dad to chemo until he passed too. You don't walk away from that kind of community." Jake felt shame burn in his throat. He'd never understood this kind of loyalty, this sense of belonging. Their conversation was interrupted by heavy footsteps on the stairs. Tom, Emily's ex-boyfriend, appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger or alcohol or both. "Seriously, Em. This guy." Tom's voice was loud in the small space. "Known him what, 2 months? Time to leave, Tom." Emily stood, but Jake noticed her hands trembling. "We were together 3 years," Tom continued. "Then I lose my supervisor position because of budget cuts, and suddenly I'm not good enough." Jake tensed, remembering the efficiency report that had eliminated several mid-level positions. Another decision that had rippled through real lives. "That's not what happened," Emily said firmly. "We grew apart. You changed." "Yeah, getting demoted changes a man." Tom took a step forward. "But this new guy shows up, starts cozying up to the union organizers, getting real friendly with you." Jake stood, positioning himself between Emily and Tom. "She asked you to leave." Tom's laugh was bitter. "Playing hero, huh? Better watch yourself, Jake. People who stick their noses where they don't belong tend to get hurt around here." After Tom stumbled away, Emily sank back onto the couch. "Sorry about that. He's been drinking more since the demotion." Jake sat beside her, fighting his guilt. "Want to tell me about it? We were high school sweethearts. Had it all planned out, he'd move up at the factory, I'd open my store, white picket fence, the whole dream." She leaned against him. "Then the cuts came. Tom started drinking, getting angry. Said I was wasting time with my fancy designs when I should focus on realistic goals." Jake wrapped an arm around her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. This close, he could feel her heart beating. "Your dreams aren't unrealistic." "No." She looked up at him. "Sometimes I think Mark's right. I trust too easily, believe in people too much." "Trust isn't weakness," Jake said, even as his conscience screamed at his hypocrisy. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative. Their second was not. Jake lost himself in the moment, forgetting his lies, his true identity, everything except the feel of Emily in his arms. Later, driving home, reality crashed back. Tom knew something was off about him. Mark was investigating his background. The workers were planning actions that could get them fired. And he, their supposed ally, was actually the person who could fire them all with a single memo. Worse, he was falling in love with a woman who would hate him when she learned the truth. Every touch, every kiss, every shared secret only made his eventual unmasking more devastating. His phone buzzed, a message from his assistant about urgent board matters requiring his attention. Jake ignored it, just as he'd ignored all company communications during his weeks at the factory. He couldn't be both Jackson Reed and Jake Miller anymore. Soon, he'd have to choose. The summons came through official channels. All department supervisors and team leaders were to attend an emergency meeting with corporate representatives. Jake watched the announcement ripple through the factory floor, noting the nervous glances between workers. "They know," Steve whispered during their morning break. Someone must have leaked information about the union. The meeting room was packed, its fluorescent lights harsh against the worn walls. Jake sat near the back, trying to blend in with the other workers. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized Robert Chen, Reed Enterprises head of operations. At the front of the room. "Recent reports indicate unauthorized organizing activities," Chen announced, his corporate smile never wavering. "Let me be clear, while workers have the right to discuss workplace conditions, any attempts to disrupt operations will be met with appropriate measures." Jake knew that smile. He'd seen it across countless boardroom tables. Chen was his own hire, brought in specifically for his ability to handle difficult situations. Additionally, Chen continued, "We've received concerning reports about unauthorized photography of facility equipment. This violates company policy regarding industrial espionage." Murmurs spread through the room. Jake felt his phone, filled with documentation of safety violations, grow heavy in his pocket. Anyone found participating in such activities will face immediate termination and possible legal action. After the meeting, Jake found himself cornered by his shift supervisor, Davis. "Corporate's breathing down our necks," Davis said quietly. "They're asking for names. I need to know what you know." Jake measured his words carefully. "I'm just here to do my job." "Look, Jake, you're new. You don't want to get caught up in this mess." Davis leaned closer. "Help us identify the troublemakers, and there might be a supervisor position opening up soon." The implied threat was clear. Jake remembered signing off on similar tactics in other facilities: pressure the new employees, offer promotions for information, isolate the organizers. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing his non-commitment would be reported up the chain. In the break room, Emily was poring over labor laws with Mark and several others. Her face was tense with concern. "They can't legally fire us for organizing," she insisted, pointing to highlighted passages. "We're protected under dash." "They won't fire us for organizing," Mark interrupted. "They'll find other reasons. Performance issues, policy violations, budget cuts." He looked pointedly at Jake. Strange how corporate showed up right after certain people started getting involved. "Don't start, Mark," Emily warned. "No, let's talk about it." Mark pulled out his laptop. "I've been doing some digging. Jake Miller's work history doesn't check out. The places he claims to have worked. No records of employment." Jake felt sweat form on his forehead. "I worked under the table at some places." "Really? All of them?" Mark turned the laptop around, showing a blank social media search. No Facebook, no LinkedIn, nothing before 2 months ago. It's like Jake Miller didn't exist until he walked into our factory. Other workers were listening now. Jake saw doubt creep into their expressions. "He's been helping us," Emily defended. "Documenting violations, attending meetings dash. Getting close to you," Mark added. "Learning our plans. Perfect position for a corporate spy, don't you think?" The accusation hung in the air. Jake stood, needing to escape. "Think what you want. I'm here because I care about what happens to this place." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Later, in the parking lot, Emily caught up to him. "I know you're hiding something," she said directly. "But I also know when someone's faking, and your concern for the workers is real." Jake couldn't meet her eyes. "Emily dash. I'm not asking for explanations. Not yet. She touched his arm. But whatever you're hiding, whatever game you're playing, people's lives are at stake. Remember that. That night, Jake received another message from his assistant. The board was threatening to remove him as CEO if he didn't return immediately. The company's stock was falling, rumors were spreading, and major decisions needed his signature. Sitting in his rented apartment, surrounded by cheap furniture and takeout containers, Jake realized he was running out of time. His absence from corporate life was becoming conspicuous, while his presence in the factory was drawing dangerous attention. Mark's investigation was getting closer to the truth. Chen's appearance meant corporate was preparing for a crackdown. And Emily, brilliant, passionate Emily, was caught in the middle, her trust in him built on a foundation of lies. The next morning, a notice appeared on the factory bulletin board: mandatory individual meetings with HR representatives for all employees. The company was making its move, and Jake would have to decide where his true loyalties lay before everything fell apart. The tension in Murphy's Bar and Grill was palpable even before the argument started. It was Friday night, and a group of workers had gathered to discuss strategy before the HR meetings began on Monday. Jake sat next to Emily, acutely aware of Mark's glare from across the table. "They'll try to intimidate us individually," Mark was saying. "Ask questions about who's organizing, who's taking photos. We need to stay united." "Easy for you to say," Tom interrupted from the next table, his voice slurred. "Some of us can't afford to lose our jobs. Not all of us have daddy's garage to fall back on." Before Mark could respond, Tom stood up, stumbling slightly. "And what about our corporate spy here?" He pointed at Jake. "Still pretending to be one of us?" The conversations around them died down. Emily gripped Jake's arm, but he could feel her tension. "Had Davis come talk to you yet, Jake?" Tom continued. "Offering promotions for names? Bet you jumped at that chance." "You're drunk, Tom," Jake said quietly. "Go home." Mark stood up slowly. "Actually, let's hear what Jake has to say. Davis talked to all the new hires. What did you tell him?" Jake felt dozens of eyes on him. These were people he'd worked alongside, shared meals with, fought for. And he was lying to all of them. "I told him nothing," Jake said firmly. "Because there was nothing to tell." Mark pulled out a folder. "Funny thing about background checks. They're pretty thorough these days." He started laying papers on the table. "Every place you claim to work. No record of employment. Your social security number. Doesn't match any Jake Miller. Your rental application. Paid 6 months in advance, in cash." The room had gone completely silent. Emily's hand dropped from Jake's arm. "Want to explain that?" Mark demanded. "Or should I keep going?" Jake stood up slowly. "This isn't the place, Dash." "No." Mark's voice rose. "When is the place?" "After they start firing people. After they crush the union. After you break my sister's heart." "Mark," Emily warned, but her voice wavered. "I accessed the security footage," Mark continued. "You know your way around that factory too well for a new hire. You know processes, costs, management strategies. You're not just some corporate spy, are you?" Jake's heart pounded. He could feel his carefully constructed world crumbling. "Who are you really?" Mark stepped closer. "Who are you working for?" "Stop it," Emily stood between them. "This isn't helping, Dash." "He's using you, Em," Mark shouted. "Getting close to you, learning our plans, probably laughing about it with his corporate buddies, Dash." Jake's control snapped. "That's not true." "Then deny it." Mark slammed his hand on the table. "Deny you're working for management. Deny you're here to stop us from organizing. Deny any of this evidence." Jake looked at Emily, saw the doubt and fear in her eyes. I'm not who you think I am." "Then who are you?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Before Jake could answer, Tom lurched forward. "I'll tell you who he is. He's the reason I lost my position. He's the reason we're all struggling while corporate gets richer." "Tom, back off," Steve warned. But Tom was past listening. He swung at Jake, a clumsy punch that Jake easily dodged. The momentum sent Tom crashing into Emily, knocking her against the table. Jake moved without thinking, shoving Tom back hard. "Don't touch her." The bar erupted into chaos. Steve tried to restrain Tom, while others moved to separate Jake and Mark. In the confusion, Jake saw Emily slip out the door, her face a mask of hurt and betrayal. "Emily, wait." Jake started after her, but Mark blocked his path. "Stay away from my sister," Mark growled. "Whatever game you're playing, it's over. By Monday, everyone will know who you really are." Jake left the bar, his mind racing. In the parking lot, Emily's car was already gone. His phone buzzed, another message from his assistant, marked urgent. The board was calling an emergency meeting. They were moving to replace him. Everything was falling apart. The workers were about to face a corporate crackdown. Emily was gone. His cover was blown. And on Monday, Mark would expose him, unless Jake exposed himself first. Sitting in his truck, Jake realized he had less than 48 hours to make things right. But right had become a complicated concept. Was it right to reveal his identity and risk undermining the workers' organization? Was it right to stay silent and watch them face corporate retaliation unprepared? And Emily, how could he ever make things right with her? The truth would only confirm her worst fears about his deception. For the first time in his life, Jackson Reed, the billionaire CEO who could solve any problem with money or power, felt truly helpless. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Jake pulled into the factory parking lot early, knowing it might be his last time doing so as Jake Miller. He barely slept all weekend, his calls to Emily going straight to voicemail. Mark was waiting by the entrance, laptop open on the hood of his car. A small crowd of workers had already gathered around him. "Perfect timing," Mark called out as Jake approached. "I was just about to show everyone what I found." Jake stopped a few feet away, noticing Emily standing off to the side, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "Our friend Jake here." Mark turned his laptop around, showing a financial news website. "His real name is Jackson Reed, CEO of Reed Enterprises, owner of this factory." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Workers who'd shared lunches with Jake, worked alongside him, trusted him with their stories, now stared at him with a mixture of shock and betrayal. "That's impossible," Steve said, but his voice held doubt. Mark clicked through to another page, showing a corporate headshot of Jackson Reed in a business suit. Despite the different clothes and grooming, there was no denying it was Jake. "Our billionaire CEO decided to play working-class hero," Mark's voice dripped with contempt. "Probably thought it was fun to slum it with the common folk. Learn our secrets. Stop us from organizing." "That's not why Jake started." "Then why?" Emily's voice cut through the murmurs. She finally looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why lie to everyone? Why lie to me?" Jake took a step toward her, but several workers moved between them protectively. "I wanted to understand," Jake said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "I wanted to see what was really happening in my factory." "Your factory?" Tom spat on the ground. "Must be nice, playing poor while you have millions in the bank. Was it fun, watching us struggle?" The crowd was growing as more workers arrived for the morning shift. News spread quickly, phones buzzed with messages, and soon nearly half the workforce was gathered in the parking lot. "Everything you told us was a lie," Mark pressed. "The stories about your past, your family, your reasons for being here Not everything," Jake interrupted. "Not what matters. Not how I feel about this place, these people. Not how I feel about Emily." "Don't," Emily's voice shook. "Don't you dare." Security vehicles pulled into the parking lot, Robert Chen stepping out of one with several guards. "Mr. Reed," Chen called out smoothly. "The board has been trying to reach you. There's an emergency meeting in an hour." "You brought security?" Mark laughed bitterly. "Planning to arrest us for talking to your boss?" "We're here to escort Mr. Reed to corporate headquarters," Chen replied. "And to ensure there are no disruptions to factory operations." Jake saw the fear in some workers' faces, the anger in others. Everything he'd tried to understand, to change, was crumbling around him. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake announced. "These people deserve answers. They deserve the truth." "The truth?" Emily stepped forward. "The truth is you infiltrated our community. You gained our trust. You learned about our plans to organize. You..." Her voice caught. "You made me fall for you. Was any of it real?" The pain in her voice hit Jake harder than any physical blow. "All of it was real. Everything I learned here, everything I felt, it changed me." "You changed me." "Save it for the shareholders," Mark sneered. "I'm sure they'll love hearing how their CEO went native." Chen stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mr. Reed, the board is waiting. They're voting on your position today. If you don't appear, they'll remove you as CEO." "Let them," Jake said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. "You don't understand," Chen insisted. "They're preparing to sell to Global Furniture. The deal's almost done. Without you there to stop it. Global." Steve interrupted. "They're the ones who shut down the Miller factory in Ohio. Fired everyone, moved production overseas." The implications sank in. Jake saw understanding dawn on the workers' faces. Their factory, their livelihoods, were in immediate danger. "Is that true?" Emily asked Jake directly. "Are they selling the factory?" Jake nodded slowly. "They've been planning it for months. That's partly why I came here. I needed to understand what was at stake before I made a decision." "And now?" Mark challenged. "Now that your little experiment is over, what's your decision?" Jake looked at the faces around him, people he'd worked with, laughed with, fought alongside. He looked at Emily, seeing past her anger to the fear beneath. "That depends," he said quietly. "On whether you'll let me help. For real this time. No more lies." The security guards were moving closer. Chen was on his phone, presumably updating the board. And in the middle of it all, Jake waited for an answer from the people he'd betrayed, hoping it wasn't too late to make things right. The factory floor was unnaturally quiet that morning. Workers moved between stations like ghosts, conversations reduced to whispers. Jake's revelation had split the workforce into factions, those who wanted to hear him out, those who wanted him gone, and those too scared of losing their jobs to take any side. Emily sat alone in the design department, staring at the prototype she and Jake had built together. Each piece of carefully joined wood now felt like a lie. Mark paced nearby, fielding calls from local labor organizers and journalists who'd gotten wind of the story. "Global Furniture's stock is up 12%, Mark announced, checking his phone. "They're already celebrating their acquisition." "They haven't acquired anything yet," Steve argued. He'd become an unexpected advocate for hearing Jake out. "If what he said about wanting to help is true. True." Tom interrupted from his workstation. "Like everything else he told us. Face it, we're screwed. Might as well start updating our resumes." Security guards stationed at every exit gave the factory the feel of a prison. Chen had returned to corporate headquarters, but not before installing cameras in the break room and posting notices about unauthorized gatherings. Emily picked up her designs, the ones she'd shared so enthusiastically with Jake. "I showed him everything," she said quietly. "Our plans, our strategies, my dreams for sustainable production." "That's probably why they're selling," Tom called out. "Rich boy saw how much money we were wasting on your environmental ideas." "Shut up, Tom," Mark snapped, but Emily was already walking away, her drawings clutched to her chest. Jake, meanwhile, sat in his rented apartment, facing his laptop. The board meeting was proceeding without him, his absence speaking louder than any defense he could offer. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his assistant, lawyers, and board members. The latest email confirmed his fears. Without his controlling interest to block it, the sale to Global was moving forward. They'd scheduled a press conference for the following day. He pulled up the factory's financial records, searching for a way out. His personal fortune was substantial, but much of it was tied up in company stock. He could sell everything, liquidate his assets, but would it be enough? And would the workers even accept his help now? A knock at his door startled him. He opened it to find Steve standing there, looking uncomfortable. The afternoon shift is refusing to work, Steve reported. They're saying if we're all getting fired anyway, why bother? Mark's talking about staging a sit-in. That's exactly what Global wants, Jake replied. Any disruption gives them excuse to accelerate the takeover. Then help us. Steve's frustration burst through. You spent weeks with us, learned about our lives, our struggles. Was it all just research for you? Jake ran a hand through his hair. I came here thinking I could understand the business better by seeing it from the ground up. I never expected. He trailed off. Never expected what? To care. To see us as people instead of numbers. Steve's voice hardened. Or never expected to fall for Emily. Before Jake could respond, his phone rang. The board chairman's name flashed on the screen. They're voting to remove me as CEO, Jake said, ignoring the call. Once that happens, I lose any power to stop the sale. So you're giving up? Hiding in your apartment while we lose everything? No. Jake grabbed his jacket. I'm done hiding. They drove to the factory in Steve's truck. The afternoon shift workers had gathered in the parking lot, their numbers growing as news spread through the town. Mark stood on a pickup's tailgate, using it as a makeshift podium. Global Furniture has a history, he was saying. They buy factories, strip them down, and ship the jobs overseas. They don't care about workers, communities, or anything except their profit margins. Jake pushed through the crowd, aware of the hostile stares and whispered comments. Emily was standing near her brother, and for a moment, their eyes met. You've got some nerve, Mark said into his megaphone as Jake approached. Come to evict us personally. I came to tell you the truth. All of it this time. Jake climbed onto the truck bed, facing the crowd. Yes, I'm Jackson Reed. Yes, I lied about who I was. But everything I learned here was real. Every conversation, every shared meal, every long shift, it changed how I see this company. How I see all of you. Pretty words, Tom shouted. But words don't pay bills. No, they don't, Jake agreed. Actions do. That's why I'm here. The board is voting to remove me because I won't support the sale. But there might be a way to stop it, if you're willing to trust me one more time. Trust you? Mark scoffed. Why should we? Jake turned to Emily. Because I've seen what this factory could be. Sustainable practices, innovative designs, fair wages, everything Emily's been fighting for. We could implement all of it, make this place a model for the industry. But I can't do it alone. The crowd murmured. Emily stepped forward, her voice clear in the sudden quiet. How? She asked simply. Before Jake could answer, security vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Chen stepped out, flanked by guards in suits who could only be lawyers. Mr. Reed, Chen called out. The board has reached its decision. I suggest you come with us now, before this situation becomes any more problematic. Jake looked at the assembled workers, people he'd come to know, to respect, to care about. Then he looked at Emily, seeing a challenge in her eyes. It was time to choose a side, once and for all. The factory parking lot had become a battleground of sorts, workers on one side, corporate representatives on the other, and Jake standing between them on the truck bed. News vans were pulling up, drawn by tips about the unfolding drama at Reed Enterprises' main factory. Mr. Reed, Chen called out again, his corporate smile strained. The board's decision is final. You've been removed as CEO, effective immediately. Any actions you take now could be considered corporate sabotage. Jake grabbed Mark's discarded megaphone. Let me tell everyone exactly what's happening here. The board wants to sell this factory to Global Furniture because their offer looks good on paper. Higher stock prices, lower operating costs, better profit margins. He turned to face the workers. But I've seen what those numbers really mean. They mean Tom losing his supervisor position because of budget efficiency. They mean Steve working 2 jobs to cover his daughter's medical bills despite our competitive health plan. They mean Emily's innovative designs being rejected because sustainable practices don't maximize short-term profits. Emily stepped forward, her voice carrying across the crowd. Why tell us this now? Why not when you had the power to change things? Because I didn't understand then, Jake admitted. I saw spreadsheets, not people. Profit margins, not lives. It took working alongside you, seeing your dedication, your struggles, your dreams. He looked directly at Emily. It took falling in love to realize what I was destroying. The confession hung in the air. Emily's eyes widened, but she stepped back, shaking her head. Mr. Reed, one of the lawyers stepped forward. Any statements you make now could affect pending legal proceedings. Good, Jake cut him off. Then let me make some very clear statements. The board's decision to sell this factory is based on manipulated data. The efficiency reports ignore long-term sustainability. The profit projections don't account for the cost to this community. You signed off on those reports, Chen reminded him sharply. Yes, I did. I made mistakes. Big ones. Jake turned back to the workers. But I'm trying to fix them now. Global Furniture will strip this factory, fire most of you, and move production overseas. They've done it 12 times in the past 5 years. Mark climbed back onto the truck bed. We know all this. What's your point? My point is there's another way. Jake pulled out his phone, pulling up documents he'd prepared all night. I'm proposing a worker-owned cooperative. I'll sell my controlling shares to a worker trust at below market value. Combined with union pension funds and local investment, we could block Global's takeover. The crowd erupted in discussion. Chen stepped forward, voice sharp. That's corporate property. You can't dash. Actually, I can. Jake held up his phone. I just filed the paperwork with the SEC. My shares, my choice who to sell them to. And I choose them. He gestured to the assembled workers. People who actually care about this factory's future. Who understand that sustainable practices and fair wages aren't expenses to be cut, they're investments in our community. Emily pushed through the crowd. You're talking about giving up control of your company. My father built this company with these people's parents and grandparents, Jake said, his voice softer. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. I forgot that. But working here, with all of you, I remembered what this place is supposed to be. This is ridiculous, Chen sputtered. The board will never dash. The board doesn't have a choice, Jake interrupted. Check your phones. The press release is going out now. Either they accept my proposal, or I go public with everything I've documented here, every safety violation, every unfair labor practice, every decision that put profits over people. Mark grabbed Jake's arm. You're really willing to give up everything? Your position, your power, your wealth. Not everything, Jake looked at Emily. Just the things that don't matter. The news cameras were rolling now. Workers were reading the proposal on their phones, discussing implications, asking questions. Chen and the lawyers huddled together, making frantic calls. Emily finally stepped forward. If you're lying again, her voice shook slightly, if this is another game. No more games, Jake promised. No more lies. I'm Jackson Reed, CEO of Reed Enterprises. And I'm asking for your help to save this factory, not for me, but for all of us. He held out his hand to her, aware of every eye on them, of the cameras recording everything, of the messages flooding his phone from board members and investors. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said quietly. But please, help me make this right. Emily stared at his offered hand, tears in her eyes. Behind her, Mark looked torn between suspicion and hope. The crowd waited, sensing the weight of the moment. Everything hung in the balance, the factory's future, the workers' livelihoods, Jake's redemption, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to heal what his lies had broken. Emily reached for his hand. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of meetings, press conferences, and legal negotiations. Jake, no longer pretending to be anyone but Jackson Reed, worked from a makeshift office in the factory's break room, keeping the space symbolic of his commitment to transparency. While reviewing documents with Emily and the workers' committee, Mark burst through the door, his face pale. We have a problem. A big one. He slapped a folder on the table. I kept digging into who might have tipped off the board about our organizing efforts. Found something interesting about our friend Tom. Jake opened the folder, Emily reading over his shoulder. Inside were emails between Tom and Global Furniture executives, dating back 6 months. He's been there inside men, Mark explained. Feeding them information about operations, worker morale, potential resistance to a takeover. They promised him a management position after the acquisition. Emily sank into a chair. That's why he's been so bitter, trying to discourage everyone. He was setting us up to fail. There's more, Mark continued. Look at the last page. Jake flipped to it, his jaw tightening. The document was a strategy memo from Global to their board, detailing plans to use Tom's information to orchestrate exactly the kind of labor crisis they were experiencing. They wanted this to happen, Jake realized. The tension, the protests, the disruption, it all makes their takeover bid look more necessary. But why would Tom? Emily started. Because I heard him, Jake said quietly. When I approved those position cuts last year, I didn't just demote him. I destroyed his sense of worth, his plans for the future. Global gave him a chance at revenge. Steve, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Tom's not here today. Called in sick. No, Mark checked his phone. He's at Global's corporate office. They're holding a press conference in an hour. Jake stood up. They're going to try to paint this as a hostile labor situation. Use it to justify immediate intervention. Can they do that? Emily asked. With the right spin, the right pressure on the board. Jake ran a hand through his hair. Yes. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Everything they'd fought for could unravel because of one bitter man's betrayal. Emily suddenly straightened. No. We're not letting them win like this. She turned to Jake. You said you wanted to make things right. Prove it. Right now. Jake met her eyes, seeing not just challenge there, but trust, fragile, newborn trust he couldn't bear to break again. What do you need? Everything, she said. All the documentation you have about Global's previous takeovers. Every email, every report, every projection you've seen as CEO. And. She hesitated. I need you to trust me completely with it. Jake didn't hesitate. Steve, get my laptop. Mark, call every worker you can reach. Emily. He smiled slightly. What's your plan? An hour later, they gathered in the factory's main production floor. Every worker who could come had shown up, along with their families, local business owners, and community members. News cameras rolled as Tom stood at Global's headquarters, painting a picture of labor unrest and corporate necessity. But the cameras also showed something else, an entire community united around its factory. Workers demonstrated sustainable production methods. Emily presented her designs, now endorsed by environmental groups. Local business owners testified about the factory's importance to the town's economy. And Jake, standing not above but among the workers, told the truth about everything, his deception, his awakening, and most importantly, Global's systematic destruction of American manufacturing communities. They want you to see conflict here, he told the cameras. Instead, let me show you collaboration. He revealed Emily's sustainable furniture line, now backed by his full support. He announced profit-sharing programs, educational initiatives, and community investment plans. But most importantly, he showed the real numbers behind Global's takeover strategy, the lost jobs, the gutted communities, the hidden environmental costs. As Tom's press conference faltered under the weight of competing narratives, Mark received a text. His eyes widened. The board, he announced. They're rejecting Global's offer. Something about reevaluating their position in light of new information. The factory erupted in cheers. Jake felt Emily's hand slip into his. You did it, she said softly. We did it, he corrected. All of us. Together. She studied his face. Was any of it real? In the beginning. No, he admitted. But every day after. Finding out who I could be, who we could be together. That was more real than anything in my life. We still have a lot to figure out, she warned. I know. The factory, the cooperative, rebuilding trust. He squeezed her hand. But for the first time, I'm not just signing papers in an office. I'm part of something bigger. As the celebration continued around them, Jake looked at the community he'd almost lost, and the woman who'd helped him find his way back to it. He'd come to Maplewood looking for understanding and found something far more valuable, a chance to make a real difference, not through corporate power, but through honest collaboration and genuine care. The factory would change. He would change. But standing there, surrounded by the people who taught him what really mattered, Jake finally understood what his father had built, not just a business, but a community. And with Emily beside him, he was ready to help the community build something even better. End.